The war was over. The flags were up. The celebrations had already started in the streets of cities that had forgotten what peace felt like. But in the spring of 1945, George S. Patton was staring at a list that made no sense. American soldiers, men who had survived German captivity, men who had endured years behind wire, were unaccounted for. Not dead, not repatriated, simply gone. The system that was supposed to bring them home had produced silence instead of names. And Patton, who had spent the entire war in forward motion, who had never once confused movement with progress when progress was actually what mattered, began asking questions that powerful men in powerful rooms did not want asked. If the war was over, why were American soldiers still missing? By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing faster than maps could record. The Third Army had torn through France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and deep into Germany, with a speed that became its own kind of legend. Patton had pushed when others hesitated. He had demanded fuel when logistics officers said there was none. He had looked at every obstacle, weather, politics, exhaustion, as something to be driven through rather than accepted. But late April brought a different kind of problem. Germany was not simply losing, it was dissolving. Units were surrendering by the thousands. Command structures were fragmenting. Administrative systems that had catalogued hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war on both sides were disintegrating alongside the regime that had built them. Records were burned. Officers disappeared. The machinery of German prisoner management was collapsing into rubble and ash at precisely the moment when that machinery was most needed. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union's westward advance had created a second reality. Soviet forces had liberated significant portions of German-controlled prisoner territory in Poland and eastern Germany. That meant American and British prisoners of war who had been held in camps within Soviet operational zones were now in Soviet-liberated territory. Getting them home required Soviet cooperation. And Soviet cooperation, it was becoming clear, was not a simple thing to obtain. Patton was operating inside this fractured landscape. The Third Army's zone gave him command authority within specific geographic boundaries, but the missing men existed beyond those boundaries, in a space where Soviet control, Allied policy, and the politics of a fragile coalition intersected in ways that did not favor speed or transparency. For a man who had always believed that delay was its own form of failure, the situation was already dangerous. The surviving record makes clear that Patton's awareness of the prisoner question was sharp, urgent, and growing increasingly impatient with the pace of answers. The mathematics of liberation should have been straightforward. Germany had held American prisoners in camps spread across occupied Europe and the Reich itself. Allied advance would uncover those camps. Prisoners would be identified, processed, and returned home. Families would be reunited. The accounting would close. But the mathematics was not straightforward. Not even close. The first problem was geographic. As Soviet forces swept through Poland and into eastern Germany, they passed through and over territory that held significant numbers of American and Allied prisoners. Camps in Silesia, in Pomerania, in regions that had been under German control, were suddenly inside Soviet operational zones. The Soviets were now, in effect, the liberating power over men who were not Soviet citizens and whose governments expected them to be returned without delay. The second problem was systemic. The Soviet approach to prisoner repatriation did not match American expectations in timing, transparency, or access. American officers, including those operating within Patton's sphere of awareness, were finding that requests for information, direct, formal, repeated requests, produced incomplete responses, deflection, or bureaucratic delay. The names on American missing prisoner lists did not match the names being returned. The numbers did not reconcile, and when American liaison officers tried to press for access to Soviet-held liberated prisoners, The resistance they encountered was not the confusion of disorganized armies. It had the feel of deliberate friction. The third problem was political. At the highest levels of Allied command, and in Washington itself, there was a powerful institutional reluctance to push the Soviet Union too hard on any issue in the spring of 1945. Stalin was an ally. The war against Japan had not ended. Soviet cooperation was considered essential to the post-war order being constructed at Yalta and in the conversations that followed. American military and political leadership was making a calculated judgment that maintaining the alliance required managing confrontations carefully. Missing prisoners were a category of problem that could, in the logic of high diplomacy, be handled through channels, through patience, through trust in the process. Patton did not trust the process. He never had. And what was emerging from the prisoner accounting was a portrait of men who were real, who had families, and who had not come home. The scale of the prisoner problem was not immediately visible in a single dramatic moment. It emerged progressively, through accumulating reports, through liaison officer accounts, through the growing gap between the official picture and the operational reality. American prisoners of war had been moved by the Germans in the final months of the war. As Allied forces advanced, German camp authorities had marched prisoners eastward, and then in some cases westward again, in chaotic columns that followed no consistent military logic. The so-called death marches of the winter and early spring of 1945 had scattered prisoner populations across Central Europe. Men died of exposure, starvation, and violence during those movements. Others survived the marches only to find themselves in territory that changed hands faster than any single authority could track. By the time Soviet forces secured large portions of eastern Germany and Poland, significant groups of American prisoners were inside Soviet lines. The Soviet military, by agreement reached at Yalta, was supposed to collect, care for, and return these men to Allied custody at designated contact points. The system had a structure. The structure was not working as designed. Reports coming into American command channels, including those reaching Patton's operational awareness, described delays in prisoner movement to contact points. Men were waiting in improvised holding areas rather than being processed toward repatriation. American requests for direct access to these facilities, for the ability to send American officers to make contact with American prisoners, were meeting resistance that ranged from bureaucratic slowness to outright refusal. The tension was real, even if the precise content of every exchange was not recorded in accessible detail. What the historical record does preserve is the pattern, a consistent gap between Soviet declarations that the process was proceeding normally and the actual pace of prisoner returns as measured against American missing lists. But the list did not match the men. Some of the discrepancy had explainable causes. Prisoners who had died during German marches, men who had escaped and were making their own way toward Allied lines, administrative errors in records that had never been perfectly maintained even under peacetime conditions. These explanations accounted for some of the gap. They did not account for all of it. There were men whose fate remained genuinely unresolved. Their names existed in American records. Their last known positions placed them in territory that Soviet forces had passed through. They had not been returned. They had not been confirmed dead. They existed in the worst administrative category a soldier could occupy, simply unaccounted for. For Patton, this was not an abstraction. The Third Army had been built on the idea that every man in it mattered to the mission. That ethos was not ceremonial. Patton's command style, aggressive, impatient, almost obsessively focused on results, was not the product of a man who accepted vague answers about the whereabouts of his soldiers. His known approach to every problem was to push, to demand, to refuse the comfortable response when the accurate response had not yet arrived. The silence was becoming evidence, and the evidence was pointing not toward German chaos, which could be catalogued and understood as the residue of a defeated system, but towards something more durable and more dangerous. The resistance to transparency was coming from an ally. The missing men existed inside a political problem, and political problems in 1945 were not being solved with armor. By May 1945, the shape of the problem had clarified enough to force a reckoning with its implications. Germany had formally surrendered. The official narrative of Allied victory was complete. The world had been told the war in Europe was over, but Patton was operating in a reality where that completion was, in critical ways, a fiction. His position was politically perilous. The command structure above him, Eisenhower, then the combined chiefs, then Washington, had strong institutional incentives to manage the relationship with the Soviet Union carefully. Friction over prisoner repatriation was acknowledged at high levels, but the response to that friction was overwhelmingly diplomatic rather than confrontational. The message from Allied command was to work through channels, to be patient, to trust that the Soviets would fulfill their commitments in time. Patton did not wait well. The historical record indicates that Patton's frustrations with Soviet behavior extended well beyond the prisoner question, but the prisoner question was among the sharpest points of moral clarity. These were men who had survived German captivity. They had endured years of imprisonment under a regime that had now been destroyed. They had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that liberation was coming, that American power would bring them home. And now, in the weeks after Germany's surrender, they were experiencing a second form of captivity, one without guards who wore swastikas, but captivity nonetheless, defined by bureaucratic friction and political calculation rather than barbed wire. Patton's known command instincts make his reaction understandable. He pushed for direct access. He pushed for accelerated repatriation timelines. He pushed within his sphere of operational authority for American officers to maintain contact with prisoner populations. The exact details of every order, every communication, every confrontation with Soviet counterparts or Allied command are not all preserved in forms accessible to general historical knowledge. But the pattern of pressure is documented in the character of the man and in the broader record of American-Soviet friction during the occupation period. The answer, repeatedly, was no. Not a final no. Not a dramatic no delivered with military ceremony, but a functional no expressed through delay, through incomplete information, through contact point arrivals where the numbers did not match, through access requests that disappeared into Soviet administrative structures and returned as silence. The war had ended on paper. Not for them. The men still missing in Soviet-controlled territory existed in a space where military force, the instrument Patton understood best, had no application. You could not drive tanks into a repatriation dispute between Allied governments without destroying the alliance itself. You could not threaten a Soviet garrison over prisoner names without producing an international crisis that would immediately be used against you. The problem required diplomacy, patience, and the careful management of alliance relationships. The precise tools that Patton found least natural and trusted least completely. This was the turning point's deepest cruelty. Patton had spent the entire war solving problems with pressure and speed. This problem resisted both, and the men whose fate drove his urgency were paying the price for a collision between his instincts and the limits of what power could accomplish. The prisoner repatriation problem of 1945 was not resolved cleanly, and history has never permitted a fully clean accounting of what happened to every man who went missing in the final months of the European War. Estimates of American prisoners held in Soviet-controlled territory vary across historical sources, and the precision of those numbers remains contested, because the records available from both American and Soviet archives have never produced a fully reconciled picture. What is clear is that the process was slower and less transparent than American families were told to expect. Some men returned weeks and months after Germany's surrender, having been processed through Soviet holding systems that operated on Soviet timelines rather than American ones. Some returned with accounts of conditions and treatment that complicated the official narrative of seamless Allied cooperation. Others never returned at all, and the question of their ultimate fate became one of the permanent, unresolved threads of the war's aftermath. The political consequence was significant in ways that extended beyond the individual prisoner question. The friction over repatriation was one of the early accumulating signals that the alliance of necessity built to defeat Nazi Germany was not a durable partnership of shared values. The disagreements over prisoner access, over occupation boundaries, over the pace of political reconstruction in Eastern Europe were the early architecture of what would become the Cold War. Patton understood this more viscerally, and perhaps more completely, than many of his contemporaries were willing to admit publicly. His expressed views about Soviet intentions during the occupation period were considered politically dangerous by Allied command and contributed directly to his eventual relief from command of the Third Army in the autumn of 1945. He was moved sideways, given an administrative role, and his voice was diminished at precisely the moment when the questions he was asking were becoming more rather than less relevant. His death in December 1945, the result of injuries sustained in a road accident near Mannheim, removed from the stage a figure who had been, in his complicated and often infuriating way, one of the few people in senior American command who refused to let the convenience of official narrative replace the discomfort of unanswered questions. What this story reveals about Patton is not simply the portrait of a difficult general fighting bureaucracy. It reveals something about the nature of victory itself, and about the moral obligations that outlast the moment when one side stops shooting and the other side is declared the winner. Victory in 1945 was real. The defeat of Nazi Germany was a genuine moral and military achievement of enormous historical importance. The men who fought for it, the men who died for it, had accomplished something that deserved to be honored and remembered without qualification. That is not in question. But victory has a shadow. Every war creates a population of people whose experience does not fit the triumphant narrative, the prisoners still unaccounted for, the families still waiting. The men for whom the celebration happening in Times Square or on the streets of Paris had no immediate personal meaning because they were still trapped somewhere inside the machinery of a war that had supposedly ended. Patton's instinct, his impatient, aggressive, sometimes politically disastrous instinct, was to refuse the shadow, to refuse the idea that the official end of a war satisfied the obligation to account for the men who had not yet come home. He was not always right. He was not always effective. His methods were often counterproductive, and his political judgment was frequently poor, but the direction of his pressure was morally sound. A war is not truly over until the powerless are accounted for. That principle does not require you to admire Patton unreservedly. It does not require you to ignore his flaws or excuse his failures. It requires only that you recognize what his urgency was pointing toward, which was not military glory, but the simple and non-negotiable truth that the men who fight a war are not resources to be managed and then forgotten when the strategic picture changes. They are people. Their names belong in a column that closes, not one that stays permanently open, because closing it would require powerful men to accept uncomfortable answers. Patton's final war was not against Germany. It was against the silence that victory can become when accountability becomes inconvenient. That war is never fully won.